cult classic movie, The Bee Movie, is a wonderful example of not taking yourself too seriously. Hoping to cash out on a dying Jerry Seinfeld's career, the directors decided that, hey, a movie about a bee falling in love with a human isn't that bad of an idea. Little did they know that overnight, their fun project would become a cult classic, and one of the most well-recognized and quoted movies to this day. The fact of the matter was that when the directors were approached about this, they said, we'd like to see you try and make a better movie about a bee falling in love with a human starring Jerry Seinfeld. The idea here was that the Bee Movie directors and the creative people behind it were okay with failing. They weren't upset when they made a mistake, which leads us into today's quotation by Colin Hightower, which states, laughing at our own mistakes can strengthen our lives. Laughing at someone else's can shorten it. So today, we'll apply two principles to this idea. First, the idea of bouncing back, which is the first part of the quotation, and the second, which is building up, which is the second part of the quotation. We need to bounce back from our own mistakes and build up others through their own. First, we'll look at bouncing back through Dennis Rodman and Joel Embiid. Then, we'll move into building up, which we'll see through George H. Thomas, the Southern Yankee, and Detroit paintballers. But first, let's move into this idea of bouncing back, because a person that bounced back well is a person that's going to succeed. And Dennis Rodman's a great example of this. Coming out of high school, Dennis Rodman wasn't recruited by any major colleges. In fact, he played community college ball for a couple of years before finally stepping down and no longer playing football. Flash forward to one night, Dennis Rodman was sitting in a parking lot of a basketball arena with a gun in his passenger seat and his hand on the steering wheel, thinking about taking his own life. In that moment, Dennis Rodman decided that it wasn't his mistakes that defined him, but what he did afterwards. He put the gun down, drove back to his house, and started working out for basketball. Flash forward, he's one of the most well-known and influential Bulls of all time, and an NBA champion. Dennis Rodman never let his mistakes define him, instead deciding to literally bounce back. Then, Joel Embiid, another basketball player, but a very different story. Joel Embiid was naturally gifted at volleyball, being from Cambodia. But he recognized that volleyball wasn't what was going to make him. So he decided to play basketball at the University of Kansas. But after one season there, Joel Embiid saw that he wasn't the best player by any means. And sure, he could block balls and swat like he did in volleyball, but there was a problem with his basketball skills. Rather than letting that define him, Joel Embiid constantly worked to where he came into the NBA as one of the most underrated players in that draft and is now an NBA perennial all-star. But it doesn't just matter if we're laughing at our own mistakes. There comes the question of, do we laugh at others? Which is where we need to realize that we need to build people up. And George H. Thomas is a wonderful example of this. An example of what happens when we don't build a man up. George H. Thomas is one of the few Southerners to actually fight with the Union during the Civil War. Deemed the Southern Yankee by Harper's Ferry, the North hated him, called him a traitor to his own people. And the South said that he was the scum of the earth. In fact, a couple years later when George H. Thomas would die, none of his family would attend his funeral in San Francisco. But the man recognized that this is what was most important, standing up for what he believed in. But the entire nation decided to laugh at his mistakes. It was this that drove him to an early grave, actually. A lot of historians suggest that George H. Thomas died earlier because of the pressure he was under from both the North and the South, shortening his life by years. Then, we can look at it by the Detroit paintballers. Now, Detroit is a city known for its violence and gunshots. In fact, there was an article once released that there was more bullets on the ground than snow one year on Christmas. But a couple of gang members in Detroit decided to change up that status quo, replacing their bullets for paintballs, deciding that it was better to laugh at their own mistakes and help build up others. One Detroit paintballer said that he would rather his son get hit with a paint pellet than a bullet. And that's exactly what they're doing, bringing joy and helping others to laugh at something that used to be a tragedy in their city. This is the idea of building up. These gangs could have continued this cycle of violence into Chicago. Instead, they decided that it was time for them to build up their community and begin to develop the next generation. So, in conclusion today, we can come back to this quotation by Colin Hightower, which states, laughing at our own mistakes can lengthen our lives. Laughing at someone else's can shorten it. Yes, the B-movie directors had it right. It was a good idea to laugh at themselves, recognize the joke that they were. But they also never went and made fun of any other cult classics. You didn't hear them saying that another animated movie that might have had a animal character falling in love with a human character was silly or outrageous. Instead, they built people up, which we can look at today. First, through the idea of bouncing back, just like Dennis Rodman did that night in that basketball arena parking lot. And then, through Joel Embiid, recognizing his shortcomings and working to increase through them. And then, through the idea of building up, looking at George H. Thomas and seeing how people pressuring around us can actually shorten our lives. And then, through the Detroit Paintballers and seeing how bringing joy can actually extend it. So stop laughing at others and start laughing at yourself.